Okay, so today I'm going to do a mini seminar on the British colonial officer, in particular Africa, with a bias to West Africa and absolute bias towards Nigeria. I think that history has been very, very unkind to this breed of man, okay? And this is the guys who implemented the British Empire and administered the colonies within the British Empire. We have forgotten their contribution. Okay, I believe we've forgotten their contribution. I believe that we, basically have demonized these chaps, if you like. And I think that most people don't really know what it is they did, okay? And the scale of what they actually did and achieved, okay? I honestly believe that, okay? Get this off. So, let's go to the continent, Africa. Look at the size of it, how vast it is, massive. It's a beautiful continent, beautiful landscapes, beautiful horizons, lovely rivers, oceans, seas, lakes. Okay? We just have a view of that, of Africa. I want you to think about, obviously if you're from Africa, then you know it, yeah? But if you're not from Africa, I want you to ponder on this vast landscape, okay? In regards to thinking, let's say in the 19th century, how Britain and I suppose other European parties viewed this area, which was virtually terra incognita, okay? It's gorgeous. Now, there was contact, as you know, with Europe and Africa, predominantly to do with the slave trade. The slave trade was orchestrated, if you like, along the coasts of Africa, okay? And the reasons for that is because when you get inside the land of the Europeans, they were subjected or succumbed to lots of diseases and germs. Unlike in America, when the Europeans went over to America and brought their germs with them, which decimated the population in America, lots of places in Africa, West Africa in particular, was known as the white man's grave. Yeah, the North Atlantic slave trade lasted for over about 300-400 years. Okay, this is an example of the Golden Triangle, where people on the ships would come there, load up, give trinkets to the chiefs and whatnot in return for slaves, and then sail over to the Caribbean and into America to sell their slaves for goods, okay, and then come back to the UK. Now, this trip went on, as I said, for centuries. This is a view of Cape Coast Castle, and this is a typical view. This, in fact, is a World Heritage Site. I've been there many times myself, but there were a number of forts along the West African coast protecting their enclave, if you like, or enclave of the route to the slave trade. Now, most people who came to these forts, British, English people, they stayed and remained within the forts. It was self-contained, and the reason for that was because stepping outside into the environment would subject them to, as I said to you before, a lot of germs and diseases which they weren't really protected for. I've actually walked along the graveyards, which is not far from this particular fort, Cape Coast Castle, and seen the ages of the people who perished there. But then, we have to remember the misery of lots of people who were underneath. Underneath there are dungeons, okay? There are dungeons where they put the slaves in, and they are not very nice at all, literally. They are just blacked out dungeons where they'd keep people in there for like 2-3 weeks at a time, before they went onto their voyage of no return. And this was a big, major thing within Britain, the empire of slavery. Okay, but when the slave trade came to an end in the early 19th century, okay, when it came to an end, and as we all know, Britain started a campaign for anti-slavery. Okay, we go into what's known as the colonial area. In fact, the way in which it's drafted is that Britain first came to Africa with commerce, yeah, even if it's slavery. Then there was conquest of the Ashanti, the Zulu, Yaba, a situation for Fulani, Yoruba wars, etc., and other areas of wars. Okay, you had that conquest, yeah, and then we have the Berlin Conference. Now, you may or may not have heard of the Berlin Conference. It happened in 1885, and that is where they divided up the map. Okay, the idea was that Europe, rather than fight amongst itself as it had done in the Napoleonic Wars, yeah, and what was going on with Britain and France, okay, they looked elsewhere in order to enrich themselves, and Africa was the foreground, if you like, okay, and they sat down there, as you know, they drafted on the map rules of engagement of coming into this land, okay, and organising it. Now, when we look at this area, as I say, there are four particular areas. You've got the commerce, you've got the conquest of the peoples, then you've got the colonialism, that's implementing, keeping it in place, organising it in administration, and then the whole idea, from the British point of view, was the raising up of these areas and territories towards Western civilization. Okay, so here we have roads, Cecil roads, employing from Cape Coast to Cairo. That is where he saw the British Empire, and that was almost succeeded. If it hadn't been for the Germans who got in Tanzania, which broke up that thing, but then we managed to administer Tanzania eventually. But you need to have a look at the scale of Africa, because I think oftentimes we don't really appreciate just how big the continent is. So here we have good sort of transposed areas of the world into Africa and where it fits. And you can see that Africa can take the whole of the United States, virtually all of China, okay? It could take Japan, India, Eastern Europe, most of Western Europe, United Kingdom. That whole expanse, okay, was what these Europeans were looking at when they were making demarcations on that map. It was vast, absolutely vast. Okay, now we're coming to a period of time which is industrialization. Okay, some people argue that the slavery and slave trade was finished because of the industrialization. There was some sort of feedback towards it. There was, for example, rebellions in the cotton mills in regards to what's going on in America, with the slave trade and the cotton trade there. But overall, it's this industrial revolution in Europe, and in particular Britain, which created a thirst for raw materials and also a desire for new markets in which to sell their processed goods. Okay? We must remember that ultimately, when we think about Africa and how Africans are treated, it was the norm. Yeah, it was a harsh life in those days. Children working at mill was a very normal thing. Okay? This is in Europe. Very hard indeed. Okay? Women working very monotonous, robotic lives, if you like. Okay? This is in Europe themselves. Okay? So the Industrial Revolution was it was in its nation, coming into blossoming in full strength, okay, in the 19th century. But Britain really wasn't really involved too much in colonialism. It had its areas of conquest, okay? And they had that thing about the Maxim gun, the poem about the Maxim gun, which gave them that terrific, just devastating advantage, if you like, where they can decimate many peoples in their conflicts because they had the technological advantage of using machine guns, okay? But oftentimes there were no real desire to settle down, okay, within Africa. What was happening was that Britain was sort of pushed into it, if you like, because of the Berlin Conference. There was fear of missing out, if you like. Okay. Now I want you to take some time to have a look at the following photographs to get an idea as to what it was that the British were getting in contact with at that time. Okay. We are talking about thousands of different tribes, okay? This chap here, funny enough, he was in a film in the 1950s, but these are tribes, the customs and conditions and traditions which we had very little way of knowing about, okay? I say we because I'm British, but I'm Nigerian, Jamaican, so I am the personification of the Golden Triangle, okay? One thing what Britain did and did well was that it did like to document what was going on, what it is they were doing. This is the photograph by Northcliffe, I believe. I'm trying to get the correct name. And he was an anthropologist, and there were lots of anthropologists who went over there to try and understand this array of different cultures. Okay, this the insignia, from their hair, from Africans' hairstyle. Okay, our ancestors had their hair in different ways. That could signify that she was a maiden, that she was unmarried, or that she was married. Okay, the facial scars have meaning, deep meaning. For example, I know with the Fante, for example, they put a little scar there in most of the children, even today. And the whole idea of that is to make the child look ugly to one of the evil spirits, so that the evil spirit doesn't take the child, okay? But some of the facial marks were to do with, obviously, tribal identity, but there are some stories regards to how those sort of stars came into being. But, we are looking at cultures which the British had no understanding. They wanted to look into the structure and the thoughts and the feelings of the peoples, okay, within that land. And we see the beauty, if you like, of the diversity, if you like, of those cultural and the cultural things. Here, the guy has filed his teeth. I think this is northern Nigeria, okay? He's filed his teeth, okay? And once again, we have the same. We have the use of body form in terms of the marks, indentations. The hair has significance. It's not any old how. It has meaning, the way you have their hair. And the total beauty. This lady here reminds me of a woman I went out with, although she didn't have the same hair. Same. She looked exactly the same. Beautiful woman. Okay? We're very proud nations and tribes, okay, with very rich conditions. And these were the people which the British came into contact with. Okay? Have a look at this. Just take it in. Please just take it in. Now, when you look at these pictures, ask yourself, what do you see? What do you think of those guys? These photos were taken around 1910. Yeah, so over 110 years ago, 115 years ago. Okay. Now, this is obviously quite recent. okay? But it's going back within the traditions of the tribes. The story about the tribal markings were, I know within the Yoruba, there was a kingdom, and a slave was being whipped, and as that slave was being whipped, and his scars healed, the queen thought their scars looked quite beautiful, and so started imitating them, and then they just became elaborate and a fashion and a way of identifying particular peoples. Okay, this here was taken once again over 100 years ago, about 110, 120 years ago, by that lady. Okay. Sometimes the facial disfigurements and the bodily enhancement, okay, would be extreme. Okay, but to the people themselves, they have meaning, a significant meaning. Just like you see people now at the moment walking around with all these elaborate tattoos. Okay, and unfortunately, these tattoos have very little meaning, only to the individual concerned. But within tribal context, these have very stark meaning amongst the people which they live. Okay, very stark meaning. Yep, the joy in that girl's eyes is just beautiful. Behold, transcends cultures. It transcends time and place. It's beautiful. Okay, and yet sadness and surprise, curiosity in that lady's eyes. Okay, but look at the hairstyle. It all means something. Okay, all means something. Now, I just want you to absorb some of these images to try and think about if you, now as a Westerner, I'm assuming you're a Westerner, not in Africa, okay? And you're coming into contact for the first time with people who are not within the industrialized nations, if you like, who are still in a feudal sort of state of advancement in the civilization, albeit complex organizations and political systems, okay? It's very hard to understand and to engage and to know what it is you're going to be doing there, okay? And of course we have the ladies today, okay? The modern. So now Africa has been divided through various kingdoms. The north with the Islamic influence, for example, in Nigeria, Kano, Sokoto, these traditions down to the south here. All these kingdoms are very, very well structured, very, very well organized. Okay, although they didn't have the modern implements, and the ones that they did have normally came from the West and the trading. Okay, their political structures were highly sophisticated, and I'd say even more advanced than democracy. Okay, here we have the Ashanti, okay, and their system, okay, down to sort of like Benin type masks, okay. So with all these kingdoms which were in existence, okay, we have that contact, if you like, with the Europeans in terms of colonialism. So colonialism really, you can say, has been broken down into 4 stages, which is the foundations of the colonial, the areas and the territories, the development of those areas and those regions, which took a big impact after the First World War, after the recession, okay? And then you got war again, the Second World War, and then you've got that road to independence. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the foundations. So, if we go back to the vastness of Africa, initially Britain left it up to many private companies in which to trade with these regions. These regions are far away, they were remote, yeah? You have people like Sir George Goldie, yeah, who was responsible for the Royal Niger Company, and his officers and men were down on the ground, and they signed up many areas within the Niger area, okay, of kingdoms to do trade. The whole idea was with trade. And, it wasn't, here's some of the sort of trades, what they used to do, okay. Well, here was a Kinnock, I believe, of the East African Company, okay. And he, once again, was dealing with peoples on the ground in Africa in a trading capacity. No colonialism going on here, okay. But then when you have the Berlin Conference, that's when you get that scramble for Africa, and then that's where Africa was partitioned, and that race, if you like, to state claim. And so what happened was that the British government brought out a lot of these companies, okay, literally bought them out, okay. I believe the Royal Nigeria Company was bought out for something like £800,000 back in the day, yeah. And technically, these were whole countries which were being bought, okay? And there was a lot of pressure for the British government to do that. They were quite reluctant. I think Chelmsford at the time, Lord Chelmsford at the time was involved, okay? But slowly but surely, these areas came under administrative rule, okay? And the question was what to do with these countries. Now, some of these areas and regions, I'll get into a little bit later, favoured the idea of actual settlement of white people, okay? So when you're looking at South Africa, looking at East Africa, such as Kenya and Uganda, and even Tanzania, Rhodesia, okay? People wanted to settle. There was an ability to settle because the climate, okay, and temperature was such that there wasn't as much diseases as there was, say, in West Africa and the so-called bush, okay? And whenever you have that situation where you have white settlers, that harbours conflict going forward, going into the future, okay? So if you go back to that scale of Africa and what, there's the size of it, the administration, you need to get your head around it. These are the areas which Britain, we took over. Okay, this is the area in terms of what it actually means. And just here, this alone, the size of the UK. Yeah. Okay. So most people, when they think about colonialism, this is the image what they look at. This is, I can't remember the name of the chap who took the stool and sat on the stool of the Ashanti. Unbeknownst to those guys sitting on that stool, it wasn't the actual royal stool. It was an imitation one. They'd actually hidden the real stool. Okay, but it was about a certain British authority. Britain had about 2 wars, Ashanti wars. Okay, and they didn't win them all. I think they lost the first one. In the end they resolved it by deception. They called on the Ashanti the king, to come over to Cape Coast Castle for a peace conference, because you can't join them. The Ashanti trusted them, came over with his party, and then they promptly jumped up and arrested them and exiled them off. So I think it's Mauritius. Yeah, and if the maximum machine gun didn't work, is by stealth and conceit. Okay, now around that time there was lots of study from Africans who'd been educated, Western educated. This one here is a book on the history of the Yorubas. Highly recommend it. Gives you a very good insight into the traditions, culture, governance of the Yoruba in Nigeria at the time, turning of the 19th to 20th century. And it really breaks down. This particular history was mysteriously lost. The guy dedicated his whole life to this writing down of this history. And when he sent it to his publisher, it was mysteriously lost. His whole life's work. The guy died, but his brother took it up and used his notes and redone the book and finally got it published. And one of the ideas why they reckon it mysteriously disappeared is it goes totally counter to the view of Africans being somewhat inferior or primitive. Okay, this book breaks it right down as to how sophisticated Yoruba were. And Yoruba are a nation, tribe of about 30 million. Yeah, that's sort of like 6 times the size of Ireland or Scotland. Yeah, in terms of population. Now, what happened was that when the British came in, they signed treaties. And here's an example, this is from the book, The History of Yoruba, of the type of treaty, what they signed. If you want, you can put it on pause, take time. This is an actual copy of a treaty, okay, which is made, okay, here. The people had to put their X, his mark, yeah? And these were the people who were in attendance to this particular agreement, witness signature. Now, of course, many, these contracts were very fair. A lot of the times, it was based on the interpretation and the translation, and sometimes the people signing didn't really know what it was they were signing. Okay, but one of the things what they did come down hard on. This is a copy of an agreement with my own sort of kingdom in Ikiti, was the abolition of human sacrifices, because there was a lot of human sacrifices done within Yoruba culture anyway. Whether it's for festivals, whether if the king died, they'd have to, literally the whole court would die. Criminals could be used for sacrifices, yeah. So they tried to stamp that out. Okay, we're talking here about towards the end of the 18th century, 19th century. This is where we have the colonial officer. Okay, so they've got signed up, they've got the territories mapped out, they've signed up with the various kingdoms. Okay, but now they need administration. Now there are a mix of Africans. I showed you some Africans before. Okay, but then you have other Africans who have lived in places, in particular, such as Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is an area and land which was created by the British after an agreements with the native kingdoms to have freed slaves after the American War of Independence. Okay, and a lot of African slaves fought there for the British. And they went all the way up to Canada and then ended up going back to Africa, but ended up with Sierra Leone. The other thing about Sierra Leone was that during the slave trade, when the anti-slave trade, should I say, and blocking it, a lot of the people who were picked up from the boats which were intercepted were sent to Sierra Leone. So it was a big hub of direct contact with European values and African values. And the reason why I'm saying that is because this guy is a classic example, if you like, of that mix. So you have these intellects and westernized Africans who are also down on the ground. And if you like, they serve as a check and as a buffer as to what the British were doing there. Okay, there was an element of cooperation and integration amongst the peoples there. A lot of them were very successful. Some were like lawyers, or they would be in the church, okay, or engineers, okay. So, you know, these Africans, if you like, are Africans who the British needed to deal with. However, and this is where it comes into important, this chap here is Sir Frederick Lugard with his wife Flora Shaw. And he was the guy who got given the mandate to rule Nigeria. And he wrote a seminal book called The Dual Mandate in British Tropical Africa. And that served, if you like, as a Bible of how to administer colonial rule within Africa. Okay, and his main tenet was indirect rule, to rule through the existing political establishments, whether it is Yoruba, Ibu, Fulani, Hausa. Okay, you rule through their kings, okay, and you leave the kings to rule the way they need to rule, but certain things, such as human sacrifices, couldn't be tolerated. Certain crimes, such as murder, couldn't be committed. When I say murder, I mean executions. So that the natives weren't allowed to execute people under authority. That had to be tried in a colonial court. But other elements, they had rule over the law. Okay, if you think of your local council and the council's rules, and then the overarching rule is the law of the land in Britain, sort of on that sort of basis. Okay, so this is Lugard here. He wrote that dual mandate. I've done a brief little video on his book, The Dual Mandate. Well worth having a read and a browse. Read it. Yeah, don't hear about it. Read it. It is mind-boggling the amount of detail which he goes into. Although it was opus magnus, although there were some faults in it that went further down the line. So at this point, we have the colonial officer, the blacks and the blues. Now, the reason why they're called the blacks and the blues were obviously black Africans working there, and the colonial officers were usually, at this stage, they were the old men of the companies, okay, who'd been in Africa for many years and thought they knew about the African, how they should treat the African, etc. A lot of them came from military background, and so that's how they administered. Okay, the numbers, the boots on the ground were very, very small. So, given the size of Africa, given the size of the territories in which they were due to manage, there was only 538. Yeah, 538. Okay, colonial officers for the whole of British West Africa. That is tiny. Tiny. So when people talk about how the British done this and done that to the Africans and blah, 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 how can 500 men dominate all those people? It just didn't happen. Yeah, it was done by cooperation. It was cooperation, the difference between a mandate, a protectorate, and dependency, colonies, etc. Okay. Lugard wanted that these guys go out there, they work with the chiefs and kings on the ground. Before nationalism in Europe, for example, Germany was broken down into 3 different states, okay, like principalities. Likewise, Italy, different principalities. Principalities were the rage in Europe. Well, in Africa, it's the same principle again, broken down into lots of different principalities with various tribes, okay? And this guy's job was to work with those particular heads of the tribes, okay, to direct them in regards to collection of taxes, in terms of what education is needed and required, whether there's a need for road building, whether the chief can help and donate, providing some sort of labour for road building. Also, in regards to education, was a bit difficult in those times because they needed to raise tax. A lot of the taxation was done on the ports in terms of the customs and excise to start off with, okay? Because a lot in terms of our agriculture, it was a subsistence agriculture where the farmers just, ate what they produced, yeah? And it was about moving that on to get produce which could be sold onto the world market, such as cocoa, such as palm oil, obviously gold, lumber, okay? Things like that. Their job was to try and direct, to influence that element. Okay, now the Great War, or Second World War, was a major disturbance in colonial terms. Okay, first of all, there was a threat to British influence in Africa, because obviously you've got countries like Cameroon, which were German. Okay, and that's right next to Nigeria. You've got also countries like Namibia, which is German. which is right next to South Africa. And you've got Tanzania, which was German, which is right next to Uganda. Okay, so it's posed a bit of a threat, and that threat meant manpower. Where do you allocate that manpower? There was, it wasn't all one-sided either, because, Germans had their colonies, and there were German soldiers and Africans fighting for the Germans. This particular famous German general who kept the British at bay, didn't overtake their territories, but through his antics and his campaigns of almost like guerrilla warfare, it meant that Britain had to keep a lot of its manpower in Africa. That manpower is not just the Europeans, but Africans who could have gone to more the Western Front. Okay, there were conflicts with the in North Africa. Okay, with King's African Rifle, which was participated in. Okay, so here we see that the Africans fought with the British for this. Okay, and they played a part. Now there was a lady, Sylvia, what's on the platform? Her name was Sylvia. She was married to, she married a colonial administrator, district officer. When she sailed over there, which is very rare in those days, which is the turn of the 20th century, in the like 1914, 1918, that sort of area. And her husband died, unfortunately, but she remained in Nigeria. And she commented and said that a lot of the time and effort, and a lot of these treaties were to protect the Africans against rivaling other Africans who were fighting against them. Okay, and Britain were coming in and saying, well, look, we're going to put an end to these sort of tribal type wars. But she commented that when the First World War came in, it showed the Africans that actually white people are having their own tribal wars. Just for point of reference, by the way, that is the King of England there, and his wife at the back there. Okay, now, so just it showed the Africans that actually, it's not just them who are having these intertribal wars. The white man also has their intertribal wars. Okay, now after the First World War, there needed to be some sort of order for the colonial service. And this chap here, Sir Ralph Fuzzy, was the man who created the system of recruitment of the colonial officers. And the blue, I mentioned about the blacks and the blues. Well, the blues were the type of men who would go into the colonial service at that time. So you had a combination of soldiers who'd just come out of conflict and wanted to remain or go to Africa because that's where they'd been before with the companies. These are the old type people. But then you got this new breed of people from the universities, typically only getting like a 2-2 in their degree or a third, but they were very good at sports, and you get the Oxford Blue. In sports in Oxford, Cambridge, you were good at sports, you get what's known as a blue. And it was these types of guys, outdoorsy type of people, like shooting, horse riding, fox hunting. They'd send them over there to Africa, but they would do a course, and that course would be about 18 months, typically in Oxford or in London. I think it was part of SOAS. Now this lady here was instrumental in helping shaping up that course. So Ralph Fuzz is the architect of the colonial officer, if you like. Marjorie Purnham, and you need to check this lady out. This is one of the unsung heroes, if you like. Okay, she spent all her life, her working life in Africa, so around Africa, looking at the British rule in Africa, and making comments on that as to how that rule was going to permeate in Africa. She wrote the biography with the cooperation of Sir Frederick Lugard. It's a mammoth book. It's just part 1 and part 2. I think that's part 1. The early years of adventure. Okay. She also wrote right near the end, The Colonial Reckoning. That's at the end of Empire. So she was right there. She was right there, as you can see from her age, right there in the midst of it. Okay. Marjorie Purnham, significant woman. Now, the Blacks and Blues, phase 2, the district officer. So these chaps, they would go out to Africa, usually by boat. There would be an assistant district officer, then a district officer, senior district officer, resident, permanent secretary. And their role was basically, by the 1937, okay, during the period of recession, okay, because what happened was that after the First World War, okay, it was an eagerness to try and go and rebuild what they've newly acquired, if you like, and that went on quite well until you got the recession in 1929. When 1929 hits, yeah, that's where it all goes a bit peaked on, okay? Now, the boots on the ground in 1937 is less than 1,500, yeah, of colonial officers, and that is for the whole of British tropical West Africa, yeah? Now, this the character in those days were that the colonial officers were known as characters, if you like. It was their strength of character which helped them through, because they were managing territories. I mean, this chap here probably be managing a territory possibly about the size of Yorkshire, yeah, on his own. And he would have to go there on horseback around various different tribal chiefs, yeah, finding out what was going on in the area, encouraging them to pay taxes, direct taxations, because it's through the taxes that the British would build. For the most part, there wasn't much aid coming from Britain. The idea was the colonies were to be self-sufficient, okay? That's where some of the mining and stuff like that. But remember, there was no industry as such as it was in Britain, okay? There's no massive proper industries as such, okay? Typically, these colonial officers would be working there between 10 and 25 years. It was a lifetime career, which they gave to. The idea was for the betterment of the people around them and surrounding them. So with Lugard, the whole idea was indirect rule. Yeah, hey boss, you're in charge. We just whisper in your ear as to what you need to do. Okay, and it worked. It worked pretty well for many years. It worked better in the north because of the Islamic culture and the structure. It suited the British and the Emirates. Okay, with other tribal systems, their political systems were a little bit more complicated, and therefore, you know, it was still a relationship. The other difficulty is obviously that some of the colonial officers had to go. Lugard was very up about having consistency, having the same district officer on the ground for many years rather than rotating, okay, because that could be disconcerting for the local leadership, the local chieftains, okay. So this was one of the areas which they sort of think about. We have it here, that classic. I believe this chap is an Ashanti on the left, and a colonial officer on the right. And you know, here we see, for example, here's a very good picture. So what you've got here are the resident and senior district officers. You have also the law, British law, yeah, which is implemented across the land. Now, that British law is an overarching law, okay, which is a bit like if you think about European Union. You know, you have European Union law, and then you have the local laws, subsidiarity, I believe it's called. Okay, that is where the local laws are still, are in place, okay, and adhered to and sought by native courts. But the bigger elements, such as massive land stuff or mining or whatever, okay, is done by the British government. Okay, we also have here a messenger, within that sort of background there. Okay, and it's important. Sometimes a messenger and an interpreter, because a lot of times one of the things about the colonial service, and when they do their preparation, is that they had to learn the local language of the place where they were going. So you'd have to be fluent in Hausa, you have to be fluent in Yoruba or Ibu, okay, or Twi in Ghana, okay. You have to be fluent in these languages before you go over there. However, obviously, you need to have a translator to give you that finer edge, okay, on that, and you'd rely heavily, or they would rely heavily on those translators. Okay, so, there's a little bit of a clash of culture. The British way of doing things was very, very different to the French. Now, here we have the French, and these are French colonial officers with their wives. Okay, so they have totally gone. Have they gone native? Not exactly, because the way the French do is that, as far as they're concerned, these people, their wives, are French citizens. Okay, and all people within their territory are French citizens. Not that they imagined that they would go into France at any one time, but that's the way they viewed them. And they ruled, I'd call it like a Roman way, in terms of the orders of how they were to be ruled came from France, as opposed to mainly predominantly on the ground, okay, in the British example. This is the chap who done the photographs of those African portraits. But what you saw earlier on. But here you have a resident with his staff, messenger behind him, the cap here, okay? And this is it. He'll be a man on his own, in charge of a vast area, okay? A British guy, only going on leave maybe once every 2 years for, 6 weeks or at a time. Lugard tried to have his cake and eat it, and tried to operate, sort of work from home before work from home was even famous, and that caused a bit of friction within the Foreign Office and Colonial Office, but that's another story. But here we are, indirect rule at its finest. You have the national chiefs, okay? Again, I believe this is Ashanti based on the umbrellas, okay? And then you have the colonial officers in their whites. The whites is a very good trick in a way. You have to think about it. In all those areas, in a lot of the mud and the slush, to maintain a white uniform is a symbol of power. It's a big symbol of power. If you can go there impeccably dressed in white, you're showing that you're coming from a situation where you have control over that environment, if you like. Okay. You'd have lots of village meetings, yeah? And this is where the colonial officers they would talk with the chiefs and iron out any particular issues of their time. They would also carry out like magistrates, if you like, court. But once again, you have that influence, that Western influence of Africans, okay, who have gone Anglophiles, if you like, okay. What a beautiful woman that lady is, okay. And I'm presuming that's her father who's going to give the bride away, okay. So they are a social class and a society class predominantly in the cities, okay. But generally speaking, this is the way. Here you have the main king, then you have the colonial officers, and then you have the village people, or city people, listening in on what the words of command is going to be. Now, Other tasks of the colonial officers during that period is to implement medicine, to create healthy. People talk about the slave trade and it's a horrid situation. But when you talk about colonialism, people never talk about the amount of lives which were saved by the introduction of Western medicine to Africa. Okay? And that was a big thing for the British to introduce medicine to reduce the rate of child deaths in births for the women, okay, and sort of stamp out a lot of these diseases such as smallpox, polio, etc. Okay. Now, this chap here to me, he looks like a messenger policeman, if you like. He is part of that administration. Okay, he's being used as a wider society. He's pushing and nudging, if you like, the old order, trying to bring it up into a new order. Okay, now in order to do that, obviously they had our armies. This is the King's African Rifles, okay, on parade. So let's go to blacks and blues. Yeah, the third phase. So the third phase really culminates with war, unfortunately. Okay, war was a major catalyst in regards to the colonial officers' tasks. Okay, first of all, it's about recruiting and trying to gain recruits to join the armed forces, to join the war front. There was a question of threats, but it was less so then because the German colonies had been taken over by the British and the French after the First World War. So there wasn't a great presence in the theatre of war in terms of Africa. However, that presence, as you know, was felt in the Far East. This chap here, for Marshal Slim, okay, and he created an army. That army was a combination of Nigerian, Ghanaian, Kenyan, Ugandan troops. These troops were very effective in the Burma campaign. Okay, probably you've heard about the Chindits, yeah, fighting. Okay, but these guys were feared by the Japanese. They had the ability to carry very, very heavy loads. Okay, and they were fierce fighters, very fierce fighters indeed. And the Japanese, if the Japanese knew that an African regiment or Gurkha regiment was going to take them on, they had fear. They had fear. Okay, and that was written. There's a good book written about that conflict. It's called Bush War, 81 West African Division in Burma, 1943 to 1945. John A.L. Hamilton. Okay, with a foreword by the Duke of Edinburgh. Okay, Prince Philip. Okay, so here you have them work with Indian soldiers, because there's over 1 million Indian soldiers fighting in there. With the Africans, it was about 100,000 Africans, soldiers fighting in the Burma campaign. We have to ask ourselves, what the hell are the British doing in Burma? It's all to do with colonialism. At that time, there's a belief that there was oil. Okay. Now, one of the side effects of the war, if you like, the Second World War, is that it raised the expectations of Africans in general. For example, as you see here, okay, we've got a corporal, okay, we've got full corporal with a lance corporal, white, yeah. Here's the thing, when you are fighting alongside people, you see their fears and anxieties, and the whole myth of white supremacy, if you like, okay, of the blues, sort of fades away slightly, not like rapidly. Also, a lot of the soldiers aren't from Cambridge and Oxford and the premier elites. Okay, they're just ordinary guys, working class guys who are in the army, and the Africans can see that. Okay, and that changes their paradigm as to who they are. The other element, of course, is that Africans are trained on very sophisticated equipment. Okay, and they're trained and use that equipment very effectively. Okay, so it's, that paradigm in terms of white people is busted. It's busted. Okay, to the level of they know that they're very highly effective fighting soldiers. So this is the guy who said it the best, Harold Macmillan. He said it near the end of independence, but this is what was going on at the end of the Second World War. Okay, he said the wind of change is blowing through the continent. Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. It was a recognition that after the Second World War, okay, Britain had been through a lot, but there were expectations in Africa as to what are their rewards. Also, the move was not only about raising taxes and trying to develop so-called nation building, okay, it was also about there needs to be self-governance in these areas which they're working with, okay. So it carried on, yeah. The colonial officers carried on. They had their presence. They'd done their meetings. Things were a lot more integrated. You have to remember the devastation of Europe, okay, during that time. The money which was pouring in from America, okay, the Marshall Plan, okay, money pouring in to rebuild Europe, okay. Britain was facing extreme austerity because of the war. It was saddled up to its neck in loans, which it didn't even pay off until like the 21st century, okay. And so, with Africa, the Americans, not only did they want their money back on the debts, they wanted access to these nice, potentially lucrative markets in Africa, okay. And so they were pushing Britain out of his colonies, trying to force them within Europe, okay, to act as a bulwark, in Europe, okay, and also to free up these markets so that Americans can sell their products, because they'd won the war, they were the victor in the Industrial Revolution too, and they wanted more markets to sell, and they wanted to get rid of these so-called protected markets, okay, but Britain had a mission, okay. And so here we see the complexity of the colonial officers now. Okay, this is the view of the colonial officers. Once again, we've got our whites, okay, as in suits, which is very hard to maintain. I'm presuming that a lot of these have got their manservants, and their manservants will make sure that those are immaculate. That is a source of power, okay. But at the same time, it's a little bit more diverse now. Okay, so they're realizing that they need to work, the colonial officers realize that they need to work with a new elite class to help shape self-government, okay? And that elite class, because in some places such as like in West Indies, also in Uganda, famously in Uganda and in Kenya, they brought a lot of Indian people there to do these administrative jobs such as clerks, clerical work, postal work, accounting and stuff like that. But within the West Africa was predominantly local people, okay, and they were building that up in that class, okay. However, all is not completely well in this run up to independence, because we have some kickback. Most of the kickback in British tropical Africa are in countries where there are white, I repeat this, where there are a white minority. The white minorities cannot stand the idea of one man, one vote, or one person, one vote. Okay? You have what's known as the Mau Mau, which is a kickback. Mau Mau itself is an abuse of the word Mao, because Mau Mau, there was a Mao uprising in America, I think at the turn of the 20th century, and that was in the Pacific, which is an American colony, and that was suppressed. They wanted some sort of an independence. Well, these were rebels, and someone, I think it's a newspaper term called the Mau Mau, i.e. Mao 2, yeah? Not Mao, yeah? Because Mau isn't Kenyan, yeah? Mau isn't a Kenyan tribe, isn't a Kenyan word, it's a Kenyan language, okay? However, the British felt the need, and colonial officers, to put this down ruthlessly, to put this rebellion down ruthlessly, because the problem was, unfortunately, the whites. The whites couldn't see the justice. They had vast amounts of agricultural land and vast amounts of wealth. Probably seen the film Out of Africa, talking about the aristocracy now banished from bloody Britain. Now decided they're going to do aristocracy 2 in Kenya, for example, and the vast amounts of wealth. Okay, and they denied the local people that wealth and access to arable land, etc., and it caused problems. Okay, so most of the problems in independence come from the areas where there are white settlers. Yeah, this chap here, Ian Smith, an honest Rhodesian, named after Cecil Rhodes. Yeah, country named after one of the commercial people creating commercial companies back in the day, as I told you about. Okay, trust Mr. Smith, trust him, trust him. Trust him for what? For maintaining the status quo of white supremacy over the rest of the Africans. Okay, it is no good, and it was at odds, in all honesty, to the colonial rule. It was at odds to the colonial administration, and so much at odds that he actually declared unilateral sort of independence from the British, which went against everything what the British colonial administration was trying to do, which was to get countries to stand on their own 2 feet with self-government as nations. Okay, so we see a lot more cooperation within the colonial office with leaders, political figures and leaders, okay, at the same time carrying out day-to-day work. Only this time they're bringing a lot more Africans within to the colonial service, okay, as they're doing that, okay. So here we see here a mix of people, and we see here, which is good, a woman who's also here as a part of it. Many of the guys brought their wives over from Britain, okay. It's interesting that they did marry native, and it created a situation in that situation where you're bringing in the English wife, if you like, and she's bringing in her sort of thoughts and decorum, if you like, within that community of colonial officers, which would be discouraging, if you like, for any interracial mixing as such. However, I wouldn't call it like racist. It's just more of a cultural situation. Here we have a wedding of one of the employees of one of the district officers, and you can see the family is pretty integrated in attendance at wedding. But on the main thing here, the most important task here was the nation building, and that nation building is working with the leaders, the political leaders now, not the traditional leaders. This is where you got that break from the Lugard, yeah, because some of Lugard's doctrines, it didn't work. So some of them, okay, because you've got that new political class, which is not the traditional ruling class, okay, and this new political class realised that the real power is in the nation state, the idea and concept of nation state. It's a question of how to build it. Here we see them in England, poor ladies having to wear nice, beautiful sheepskin coats, okay, keep them. So here you got the old traditional ruling class, but their power has actually been undermined now because things are going ahead at full steam to bring the country into a modern type entity. Okay, so they still have their powers and their traditional powers. They still have their traditions over the customs. Okay, you see that despite this is a Yoruba king here, a Kabisi, yeah, Kabisi. Here, the old tradition was that you should never see the king's face. Okay, this was a mark, although it was supposed to ward flies off, it was also a mark of power. Okay, but we also see his watch. Okay, and the tendency was to move towards the Western educated African, and even better, that they were part of the aristocracy, African aristocracy, you know, of the royal lineage. So you see here, Chief Anthony Ndahoe, yeah, Minister of Home Affairs. Okay, so we have an African of a royal background. Okay, British educated. Okay, is a part of that nation building. Okay, funny enough, this is not how my father was. He was of African royalty, came to Britain in the 60s, university here to study shipping of all things. And as part of that new African, yeah, this I think it's the princess. I don't know which one it is. I think it's one of the cousins. Okay, Shante again. Okay, but now we've got the political leaders. Yeah, Kwame Nkrumah. Okay, comments below on the other people next to him. I think it's probably part of the Big Six in Ghana. Okay, but you know, in all honesty, they got to their positions off the backs of the soldiers who've come back from the Second World War. Okay, but the colonial administration at this point is really, really focused on how do we get elections, how do we, you know, gather up the people so that they know how to vote to ensure that it's democratically done. Okay, these are leaders of the north of Nigeria, at Hausa. Okay, and these are some of the big stars. Zeke, can't remember this chap's name. Okay, these are the big stars. Okay, Banuela, yeah, it was the first prime minister of Nigeria, and then last we have independence. Okay, now that independence was all organised in terms of the electoral and the elections, not just in Nigeria, but throughout, even in Ghana, for example, first one to get the independence. Okay, it was all done by the colonial officers. Yeah, they're the ones who organised it. And remember that throughout a lot of the places there, the people were illiterate. So it was no mean task, okay, in order to bring that into being, okay. Here we have our Majesty, the Queen, who's in Nigeria. I think that is, let's see, that's, can't pronounce his name now. It's the Yoruba leader, Obafemi, I believe, okay. Here's our late Queen, Elizabeth, okay. I believe this is in London. And yeah, the Britain were very close. It's Kwame Nkrumah, obviously Queen Elizabeth, King Charles now, King Charles III, Princess Anne, and Prince Philip. Okay. What I'm trying to say is that Kwame Nkrumah is a long way, okay, from the initial Africans which British had met, say in that photo, 60, 70 years ago. Okay? A long way. He's a great man, great family. Okay? So this is it. This is the British turned into the Commonwealth. Okay? And it hands back to these guys. They're the ones who helped shape Africa. They're the ones who tried to rally and create these nations which we have. They were forced out of it early, okay? They were forced out of it early. But nonetheless, they've done as good a job as which they could do. That's it, really. That's all I want to say about that. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe.